History often tells us who won. It names the battles, the blades, the kings who claimed the spoils. But the story rarely lingers on what came after the silence, the night. Because for the ancient soldier, war didn't end with the last command. It followed into the dark, into quiet camps, into sleep that never quite felt safe. A kind of rest carved from exhaustion more than comfort, and always earned. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, or maybe where you're drifting off. Now, loosen the armor of your day. Pull the blanket a little closer. Let the light dim. Let your breath match the rhythm of old footsteps on cold earth. Tonight, we return to the field, not to fight, but to understand. How soldiers once searched for rest in a world built for anything but peace. In quiet corners between battles, where sleep came not as a gift, but as survival. Let's begin. When night came to the battlefield, it did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, settling over the terrain like a heavy, familiar cloak. Shadows lengthened across rutted earth, and the sky deepened from blue to black, dimming the last glimmers of armor and spear points. The sun, once relentless in its heat, dipped behind the horizon, leaving behind a sky brushed with ash-gray clouds and the faintest scent of smoke still hanging in the air. Across time and geography, from the sun-baked plains of Anatolia to the misty hills of Britannia, soldiers knew this moment well. In every century, under every banner, when the fighting paused, however briefly, men prepared to rest. They did so not with ceremony, but with quiet routine. No matter the army, Roman, Greek, Assyrian, Han, the process was broadly the same. Lay down what gear you could spare, roll a cloak if you had one, clear a patch of ground if the ground allowed it, and sleep. Some slept in loose rows, shoulder to shoulder, the warmth of a fellow soldier lending comfort. Others scattered around dwindling fires, wrapped in threadbare wool or animal hide. The materials changed across civilizations, but the posture rarely did curled inward, knees drawn close, with one eye always half open. Above them, the stars burned steadily, ancient witnesses to the same tired routines. The moon, in whatever phase it chose, cast its pale light over discarded helmets, rough-hewn spears, and rows of sleeping forms that might just as easily have been mistaken for fallen ones. The battlefield did not become peaceful. It only grew quieter. There were still sounds, the restless stomp of horses, the creak of a leather strap, the distant murmur of voices carried on the wind. But gone was the clamor of command, the clang of iron, the scream of urgency. In its place came the slow rustling of blankets, the muted thud of bodies easing down, and the occasional sigh of a man letting go of his thoughts. Even among history's most disciplined ranks, the Spartans, for example, or the legions of Rome, sleep was rarely scheduled and never guaranteed. A soldier might have marched 20 miles that day, dug ditches, built fortifications, eaten a scant ration, and still lie awake with thoughts circling like wolves. Home, wounds, orders, omens, these occupied the silence. And yet sleep came. It had to. The body would eventually yield to it, if only for a few hours. Sleep was not indulgence. It was survival. Muscles stiff from combat would seize if left too long. Eyes would blur without rest. And so, soldiers learned to sleep whenever and wherever they could. Sometimes that meant resting propped against a tree. Other times, lying in a trench dug into the soil, with one hand still curled around a weapon. Some ancient Chinese warriors were trained to nap in intervals, resting lightly even while upright. In desert armies, cloaks were drawn over the head to shield against wind-blown grit, turning each man into a featureless mound under the stars. And in colder climates, soldiers would burrow into straw or leaves, their breaths rising in pale clouds, chests moving slowly beneath layers of wool and fatigue. There was no telling what tomorrow would bring in ambush at dawn, a long march, or the sudden roar of horns. But in the space between dusk and duty, men made what rest they could. In the end, it didn't matter if the cause was noble or misguided, if the war was just or foolish. When the sky darkened and the fires dimmed, soldiers across history all met the same stillness. Their armor might have gleamed differently, their gods might have had different names, but the night treated them all the same. Under the same sky that blankets us now, they closed their eyes. Some murmured prayers. Others watched the stars until they blurred. And slowly, quietly, they surrendered to sleep. When soldiers laid down to sleep, comfort was rarely part of the plan. What they lacked in bedding, they made up for in practicality. The tools of war, the shield, the cloak, the helmet, were repurposed at dusk, becoming crude furniture in an open-air barrack. Among the Roman legions, the scutum, a long curved shield made of wood and leather, was more than just protection. At night, it could be planted upright to block the wind or laid flat beneath the soldier to lift him slightly from the damp earth. Its hard surface was unforgiving, but it was dry, and sometimes that was enough. Greek hoplites, too, found other uses for their gear after sunset. Their round, bronze-faced shields or hoplons were heavy and concave. Not suitable for resting ahead, perhaps, but useful as a backrest or windbreak, tilted just so against a pile of rocks or the base of a tree. Their cloaks' coarse wool, dyed crimson or dark-served, as both blanket and mattress. Folded in half, tucked beneath shoulders and knees, it offered modest insulation against the night's creeping chill. These arrangements were not designed for luxury. They were made for necessity. In ancient Persia, the elite immortals carried bows, short spears, and wickerwork shields that, once the sun fell, became makeshift lean-tos or pillows with a little creativity. Some placed saddlebags beneath their heads. Others balled up spare tunics. And many simply lay on the bare ground, arms crossed over their chest, the night air doing what it would. A soldier might wedge his helmet beneath his neck for support, though few found it truly restful. Bronze or iron, it dug into the skin and left strange patterns on the scalp by morning. Still, it elevated the head and offered a small illusion of control useful in unfamiliar territory, surrounded by distant noises and unknown shapes in the dark. In colder regions, soldiers often clustered for warmth. Cloaks were shared, body heat conserved beneath layers of wool and leather. The smell of sweat and smoke clung to every garment. Even so, the presence of a fellow soldier close by breathing slow, murmuring now and then in his sleep, could provide a sense of safety that no equipment could offer. In temporary camps, the ground might be covered with straw, pine needles, or even cloaks layered to soften the earth. But more often, there was nothing between a soldier and the soil. Rocks were nudged aside. A patch of moss, if found, became a treasure. Dry ground, even more so. The way a man slept reflected his experience. Veterans learned quickly never place your sword out of reach. Don't remove your boots unless you're certain of a quiet night. Keep your water skin nearby. And always face east if expecting orders at dawn. In armies like those of the Qin or Han dynasties, gear was uniform and plentiful, but sleep still had to be claimed in shifts. Rest was rationed like food. Shields doubled as dividers, giving a suggestion of privacy among rows of weary men. Sometimes, silence stretched long into the night. At other times, soft voices traded memories, rumors, or speculation about the next day's orders. But even in the quiet, there was movement, someone shifting, rolling over, pulling a cloak tighter, adjusting a shield beneath their knees. These improvised beds were not ideal, but they were familiar. And in the rhythm of campaign life, familiarity was its own form of comfort. So they lay there beneath stars and clouds, wrapped in wool, pressed against wood, breathing the mixed scent of iron, leather, and the earth itself. No feathers, no bedsheets. Just the solid curve of a shield, a cloak drawn over the shoulders, and the long, slow wait for sleep to settle in. Long after the sun had vanished, when the sky was thick with shadow and silence hung heavy across the field, the campfire remained. Its glow reached softly across rough terrain, casting flickering shapes against tents, shields, and tired faces. No matter the century or continent, fire was a fixture of the soldier's night, an anchor in a drifting world. There were practical reasons, of course. Fire gave warmth when the night air turned sharp, and light when the stars were obscured. It dried wet cloaks and cooked what little food there was to eat. But beyond its function, the fire offered something less tangible. It provided a place to gather, a place to pause. In Roman encampments, soldiers would settle into quiet clusters, backs to the wind, boots stretched toward the coals. Flames danced in bronze helmets, catching the dull shine of buckles and blades. Bread warmed on flat stones. Wine, thin and watered down, passed slowly from hand to hand. The Greeks might hum old verses, fragments of poetry, or hymns, spoken more for comfort than for meaning. In some parts of the East, soft chants or low prayers echoed quietly, words rising into the smoke like offerings. Voices stayed low. Loud talk was discouraged, especially near the front. But murmured stories still found their way around the embers. Soldiers spoke of home fields waiting to be plowed, wives expecting letters, children growing older. They spoke of omens and weather, of orders received and rumors overheard. Sometimes they said nothing at all. Silence, shared and unforced, was also part of the ritual. The fire, though small, created a sense of shape in the darkness. Outside its ring, the world dissolved into formless black. But within it, there was definition. Faces could be seen. Shadows moved predictably. One could forget, just for a while, the uncertainty of the next morning. Occasionally, someone would take a stick and stir the coals. Sparks leapt upward, brief and brilliant. The sound soft popping, the sigh of shifting ash was oddly soothing. A kind of rhythm, gentle and repetitive, that lulled the mind toward rest. In the armies of the Near East, where tents might form winding rows through the sand, fires were often built low to the ground. The scent of smoke mingled with spice and dust. Men reclined on mats or bare earth, their eyes reflecting the orange light. Here, as elsewhere, the fire served not only as warmth, but as boundary, a visible line between one's own camp and the unknown beyond. In colder regions, the fire was kept small, to preserve fuel. In warmer climates, it was still maintained for habit, for morale. In every case, it was watched carefully. A fire too large drew attention. Too small, and it vanished too soon. Children raised near garrisons sometimes recalled the image of their fathers, cloaked and quiet, seated by the flames in a circle. No drama, no laughter, just men existing together in stillness, eyes low, shoulders hunched, their weapons lying close. Occasionally, someone would offer a tune, a slow melody, often unfinished. No audience, no applause. Just a drifting hum that softened into the night. Others might join or not. It didn't matter. The song was not for performance. It was for pacing the mind, giving shape to silence. And when sleep crept in, it did so gently. Conversations thinned. Bodies slumped. The fire, once lively, reduced to quiet red embers. One or two might remain awake, poking at the ash, watching the flame fade with the night. And so the fire burned not bright, but steady. Not loud, but present. A small glowing reminder that even in the midst of war, there was a place to rest your voice, warm your hands, and listen to the quiet sounds of life continuing, one flicker at a time. Sleep did not belong to everyone at once. While some laid down their cloaks and drifted into uneasy dreams, others remained awake, watchful, still, and quiet beneath the stars. For as long as armies have moved across landscapes, there have been those who kept the night's vigil, the Watchers. The system of night watches varied by culture, by structure, by century. But the principle remained steady. Someone must stay awake so that others may rest. It was not a glamorous duty, nor an especially welcomed one, but it was necessary. And for many, it became a rhythm of its own. In Roman legions, the night was divided into watches known as vigili, typically 4 shifts, each lasting 3 hours. Bronze water clocks or hourglasses marked the passing of time, and at the change of each shift, a horn or bell would sound softly. Soldiers assigned to the watch would rise from their cloaks without complaint, their movements practiced, minimal. They tightened belts, shouldered their arms, and stepped carefully through rows of sleeping forms. The tasks were simple, but vital. Walk the perimeter, tend to the fire, listen, observe. Most of the time, nothing happened, and that was the goal. A good night was an uneventful one. The watchers often moved in pairs, exchanging few words, footsteps muffled against earth and dust. Their eyes scanned the distance for movement, for sound, for anything out of place. In the armies of feudal Japan, night watches followed a similar model. Samurai and ashigaru rotated in shifts, particularly during sieges. Guards were instructed to note the positions of stars, or the flickering of torches on distant hills. Silence was strict. Communication came through gestures, or the low murmur of a name. Even the clink of armor was subdued with cloth wraps and careful steps. Among nomadic group Scythians, Mongols, and others, the system could be less formal, but no less effective. The lightest sleepers would naturally rise at intervals, walking the edge of camp, checking horses, glancing at the horizon. Each man knew the risks of sleep taken too deeply, and so a kind of unspoken vigilance filled the gaps where structure left off. Those who kept watch saw the night differently. While others dreamt, the watchers stood beneath wide skies and shifting clouds. They felt the cold settle into their joints, listened to the small noises of the dark and owl far off, a branch settling, the rhythmic breath of sleeping comrades. Occasionally, they would crouch beside the embers of a fading fire, warming stiff fingers before continuing their rounds. Fatigue was the true enemy. Eyes grew heavy, steps slowed. In some camps, guards were rotated after only an hour or two, just enough to maintain clarity without courting error. A lapse could be costly, not just for the watchman, but for the sleeping dozens behind him. Still, for all its weight, there was something strangely peaceful about the duty. In that quiet stretch of hours, when most minds wandered into dreams, the watcher remained grounded-rooted in the present. Time passed differently when you were the only one awake. In the distance, fires from enemy camps might shimmer faintly. The shape of a tent might shift slightly in the breeze. And far overhead, stars continued their slow, familiar journey. The watcher could do nothing about the war to come. His duty was here, in the now. Eventually, the next shift would arrive another figure wrapped in a cloak, eyes heavy but determined. A nod would be exchanged, no need for words. The role passed on like a slow, quiet porch. And so, while half the army slept, the other half watched. In silence, in patience, in the long rhythm of duty that wrapped itself around the night like a second cloak, until the sky began to pale again, and another day prepared to unfold. A soldier slept where he could, and more often than not, that meant sleeping beneath the open sky. The comforts of walls and roofs were rare. Instead, rest came on uneven ground, exposed to whatever weather the night decided to bring. In spring, rains were common. The ground softened underfoot, and the air was heavy with moisture. Cloaks soaked through slowly, and puddles formed in shallow depressions where careless boots had trodden. Soldiers slept curled tightly, trying to keep fabric off the mud. If they were lucky, they found a patch of grass lightly raised where the water ran away rather than pooling. A companion's cloak might be stretched between two shields to form a makeshift canopy, barely large enough to shield the head and shoulders. The scent of damp wool, wet leather, and newly turned soil filled the air. Summer brought other challenges. In hot regions, the days were blistering, but the nights could be surprisingly cool. Cloaks were still used, not for warmth, but to keep the dust off dust kicked up during the day, lingering in the air like smoke, settling on everything in fine, dry layers. The stars were clear and sharp, and insects buzzed around slowly dying embers. Mosquitoes hovered in clouds. Flies clung to skin. Sleep, when it came, was shallow. A soldier might wake a dozen times, brush something from his face, shift, adjust, and fall back into half-dreams. And yet, with time, even this became routine. Autumn was quieter. Cooler winds returned, and leaves drifted into camps, gathering in the corners where tents met the earth. The nights lengthened. The crackle of fires seemed louder. Soldiers wrapped themselves tighter in their cloaks, sometimes stuffing spare cloth into boots or beneath tunics to block the chill. Breath became visible, faint wisps rising in the lamplight. Some carved hollows in the earth, lined with straw or pine branches, and nestled in like burrowing animals. These slight depressions helped retain heat, though they also collected frost. Still, they were preferable to sleeping flat on hard, frozen soil. Winter, however, was another matter entirely. In regions where snow fell, sleep became an exercise in endurance. Fires were banked carefully, tended through the night. Logs were rationed. Hands trembled as they gathered kindling. Blankets were where most relied entirely on cloaks, layered and pinned tight. In some armies, soldiers were permitted to sleep in pairs or small groups, their backs pressed together beneath shared coverings. Body heat became a resource. Boots stayed on, gloves remained in place, even while sleeping. Tents, when available, trapped the cold as much as they blocked it. Breath condensed on fabric, forming beads of frost by morning. The air inside was still muffled, dense with the smell of sweat, wood smoke, and unwashed wool. Yet even in these conditions, sleep still found its way. Not deeply, not peacefully, but enough to survive the hours between dusk and dawn. In arid lands, where nights followed scorching days, sleep came under a wide, moonlit sky. The silence stretched for miles. The coolness was welcome, though sand crept into everything, into eyes, into mouths, into folds of clothing. Soldiers would often wrap their heads loosely in cloth, eyes covered, noses exposed, resting like statues beneath the stars. Rain, snow, wind, or heat, it didn't matter. The elements were constant companions. There was no choice but to sleep through them, beneath them, beside them. Sometimes the weather woke a soldier. Sometimes it simply became part of the dream, and so they adapted. They learned the best folds for a cloak, the best places to lie when the wind shifted. They recognized the scent of approaching rain, the feeling in the bones when frost was coming. And still, each night, they lay down again beneath clouds or stars, in mud or dust or drifting snow, and surrendered to rest as best they could, trusting that the morning would bring light, orders, and movement once more. Not every soldier slept beneath the open sky. When time allowed, and when the ground was willing, shelter could be built, fashioned from canvas, wood, turf, or even earth itself. These shelters were rarely comfortable in the way one imagines a home, but they offered a kind of protection, a thin barrier between the body and the wind, between the sleeper and the unknown. In the Roman legions, tents were standard issue. Each contubernium, a group of 8 soldiers, shared a single tent made of leather stitched together from the hides of dozens of animals. The tent was low to the ground, its sides sloping inward, the roof just high enough to sit beneath. Poles and ropes supported it, while the edges were weighted with stones or stakes. Inside, Soldiers lay shoulder to shoulder on straw mats or simple woolen blankets, their shields propped near the entrance, their sandals set neatly by their heads. There was little space. Movement required coordination. The air inside grew thick with breath and body heat, and the walls absorbed the sense of men who had not bathed in days. But it was dry, and it was warmer than the night air, and that, in most cases, was enough. Elsewhere, and especially in colder or forested regions, soldiers constructed temporary huts. These were not elegant, but they served their purpose. Branches formed frames, woven together with reeds, grass, or rope. Blankets or hides were draped over the top. Some dug shallow trenches inside, lining them with straw or dry leaves, to sleep slightly below ground level, where warmth lingered just a bit longer. During prolonged campaigns or sieges, these structures became more refined. In medieval encampments, timber huts were sometimes raised if enough tools and labor were available. Crude chimneys were fashioned from stacked stones. Openings were cut for smoke to escape. Mud sealed the cracks. These huts provided brief moments of domesticity, small corners of stillness in otherwise shifting days. In harsh terrain, soldiers made use of the earth itself. Hillsides were hollowed, rocks rearranged. In mountainous areas, small caves became impromptu barracks. Even shallow depressions, shielded by low ridges or thickets, were adapted. Canvas was stretched across gaps. Snow, when plentiful, was used as insulation. The cold could be managed, if not quite mastered. Shelter brought with it a sense of separation from the sky, from the sounds of the camp, from the persistent uncertainty that followed every soldier. To lie within a tent, even a cramped and sagging one, was to reclaim a little distance from the outside world, a space just large enough to close your eyes without scanning the horizon. At night, the soft rustle of fabric or the faint creak of rope could be heard. Conversations fell to whispers. The flicker of firelight played against the inner walls, casting slow-moving shadows as men shifted in sleep. When rain tapped lightly overhead, it was almost melodic, a rhythm not unwelcome. Shelters were never permanent. They were built to be left behind. But for the few nights they stood, they mattered. They marked a pause in motion, a place to sleep with fewer interruptions, fewer questions. In the morning, the tents would be folded, the huts abandoned, the dugouts left to collapse under their own weight, and the road would call again. But while they stood brief, makeshift, and fragile, they offered a quiet comfort. A roof, however thin, a wall, however low, a sense, however fleeting, of being somewhere just slightly safer than before. For soldiers far from home, comfort was rarely the goal. Rest was measured not in softness, but in survival. And yet, even in the roughest conditions, men found ways to ease the weight of exhaustion, using what they carried, what they found, or what they could shape with their hands. The ground, more often than not, was the default bed. Hardened by sun or softened by rain, it offered no concessions. But soldiers learned to read the earth. They looked for patches where grass grew thick, or where pine needles formed a natural mat. Sandy soil, though dry, could shift away under the body. Clay held the cold. Rocky terrain offered little reprieve. Over time, preferences developed. Flat ground was useful, but even better was a slight incline, just enough to allow water to drain away and the spine to rest in a natural line. When possible, bedding was fashioned. Roman soldiers carried sagum, a heavy woolen cloak that doubled as a blanket. At night, it was drawn over the body, sometimes wrapped tightly with a belt to hold in warmth. Beneath them, bundles of straw, dried reeds, or even gathered leaves created a buffer between body and earth. These makeshift mattresses were simple, but effective. They kept the cold from seeping upward and helped protect against the insects that stirred in the soil below. In medieval encampments, rolls of fabric served as both luggage and bedding. Thick canvas sacks could be filled with grass or feathers, if time and location permitted. These were rarely plush, but they lifted the body off the bare ground just enough to offer relief to tired joints. Blankets, when available, were prized. Wool remained the material of choice, dense, insulating, and able to retain heat even when damp. Soldiers often slept in layers: tunic, cloak, and blanket, folded and rearranged until some balance of warmth and breathability was achieved. Improvisation was key. In colder regions, shields might be laid flat and covered with cloth, creating a dry surface to slip on. Saddle blankets, usually worn and stiff from use, were repurposed. Spare garments, if not needed for warmth, were folded beneath heads as makeshift pillows. Helmets, inverted and padded, could serve the same purpose. In armies on the move, gear often served dual roles. A rolled-up pack might act as both a cushion and a boundary, a subtle division between one soldier's sleeping space and the next. In tighter quarters, especially within tents, men slept shoulder to shoulder, legs angled slightly to avoid overlapping. Space was negotiated without words. An elbow shifted here, a knee tucked there. Bodies adjusted to the presence of others in near silence. Those stationed for longer periods sometimes built low platforms from logs or stone slabs, raising their sleeping space just inches off the ground. Even this small distance helped avoid dampness, cold, and crawling things. Over time, some camps developed into miniature villages of such beds, simple, sturdy, and worn smooth by use. In desert regions, bedding had to adapt again. The sun baked the earth during the day, but nights brought a sudden chill. Cloaks were laid out early, gathering the last warmth of sunlight before being drawn around the body. Sand was shaped into shallow hollows, forming a cradle of sorts, the edges packed tight to reduce exposure to wind. In colder climates, snow was compacted beneath the body, sometimes layered with pine branches or straw. Sleep came in brief, shivering stretches. Yet even here, routines formed, rituals, the way the cloak was folded, the angle of the body to the wind, the last glance upward before sleep, toward a sky emptied of sound. What they slept on was rarely soft, but it was functional. It reflected a quiet ingenuity, a willingness to adapt, to make do, to find stillness on unforgiving ground. For the soldier, bedding was not about luxury. It was about creating, however briefly, a place to let the body rest. A place where the war, for just a few hours, could fade into the background. When darkness settled over a military encampment, quiet did not come all at once. It arrived slowly, like mist rising from the ground, weaving through tents and resting over the shoulders of weary men. The day's commands faded into memory. The noise of movement dulled. But still, the night was not silent. There were always sounds, subtle, layered, and ever-present. The first were human. A cough here, a whispered exchange there, the rustle of cloaks being adjusted, of bodies shifting on uneven ground. Footsteps softened by straw or earth passed by as sentries began their watch. Somewhere, a man murmured a prayer beneath his breath. Another, farther off, sang softly to himself in a language foreign to the region, a lullaby remembered from a distant home. Closer to the fires, wood cracked and shifted as embers settled. Flames were kept low at night, but never fully extinguished. The glow cast a faint light on nearby tents, flickering softly against canvas walls. Pots still hung over coals, the contents cooled and forgotten, giving off one last whisper of steam into the night. In larger camps, the sounds were more numerous, yet somehow no less calming. A distant clang might echo the sound of a sword or helmet being set down too firmly. Horses snorted in their lines, hooves shuffling against the dirt. The rhythmic jingle of bridles or the faint creak of leather straps could be heard if one listened long enough. And there were voices not loud, not disruptive, but always present. officers on quiet grounds checking positions, guards exchanging passwords. A brief laugh, quickly stifled. The low murmur of conversation around fading fires. Even among the disciplined, the urge to speak at day's end lingered. Then there were the sounds beyond the camp, the ambient language of the surrounding land. In forested regions, the night spoke in the hush of trees. Leaves stirred gently in the breeze, branches creaked overhead, and insects filled the spaces between with a constant, soft hum. Owls called to one another from unseen perches. The occasional rustle in underbrush reminded the listener that they were not entirely alone in the woods. In deserts, night was vast and hollow. The wind blew across open spaces, carrying with it the grains of sand that hissed along the ground. The sound was subtle, almost melodic. Stars shone with quiet clarity, and though no creature stirred nearby, the vastness had a sound all its own like breathing, slow and distant. Coastal camps brought their own rhythm. The sea, even at rest, moved steadily. Waves rolled onto shore with metronomic calm. Gulls called faintly in the distance, their voices softened by the dark. Salt hung in the air, and the fabric of tents fluttered gently under the touch of the ocean breeze. No matter the setting, a soldier grew used to these sounds. They became familiar, almost comforting. Sleep came easier when one could hear the predictable rhythm of others nearby, the breath of the tentmate, the regular steps of the night guard, the quiet crackle of a shared fire. Even the noises that might once have caused uneasy animal calls, shifting wind, distant voices, began to blur into background, part of the landscape of the night. And still, the camp never truly slept. Someone was always awake, always listening. For the sleeping soldier, this brought reassurance. He could surrender to rest knowing that others stood in his place, that the night was being watched, that the perimeter was held. So he drifted, not into silence, but into a world of hushed sound, a world that cradled him, that reminded him he was still among the living, still part of the many, still breathing beneath a sky that had seen it all before. Sleep, for the ancient soldier, was never promised in full. It came in pieces rarely deep and often brief. For even at night, the camp required eyes. And so, long after tents were drawn and cloaks wrapped tight, the business of keeping watch continued. Guards were chosen by rotation, sometimes by lot, sometimes by command. In Roman armies, the night was divided into 4 watches, each about 3 hours in length. From sunset to sunrise, a cycle turned fresh sentries replacing the weary, the line maintained without pause. In medieval camps, a similar rhythm took shape, though less rigid, often shifting based on threat or terrain. For those on duty, the world grew quieter but never still. Wrapped in cloaks, clutching spears or swords, they walked slow circuits around the camp's edge, listening, watching, feeling the cold settle in their joints, the crunch of footsteps on frosted grass, the low whistle of wind moving through tents. Their ears tuned to everything, the distant bark of dogs, the flap of canvas, even the too familiar silence that came before a disturbance. Sometimes the night passed uneventfully, but even then the mind wandered. Thoughts returned to the fire, to comrades now resting, to home. Some guards whispered to themselves, humming songs from childhood. Others stood in absolute stillness, watching the stars shift above, their breath visible in the cold night air. For those trying to sleep, the presence of a watchman brought comfort. Yet sleep did not always come easily. The mind, even when tired, remained alert. A sudden shout in the distance, the quick rhythm of boots on packed soil, the rattle of armor being lifted in haste. These moments, brief, unannounced, reminded all within the camp how close danger always lingered. Sometimes the alarm was false, a branch breaking under the weight of a curious animal, a cloak catching on a spear, but other times the call to arms was real. and sleep was interrupted by the urgent clang of a bell, or the blast of a horn, sharp against the fabric of night. Men leapt from bedding, grabbing swords and shields in the dark. Torches were lit. Voices called out orders. Eyes strained against the shadows for signs of movement. Yet not every interruption was violent. Sometimes it was the weather that woke them. Rain soaking through seams, cold wind slipping under cloaks, or the slow, creeping discomfort of sleeping on a slope, the body drifting downward through the night. Insects crawling beneath blankets, the subtle sting of frost on fingers and toes. Sleep, then, became a skill, learned through repetition, honed by necessity. Soldiers adapted. They learned to rest when they could, to sleep in snatches a half-hour here, an hour there, between assignments or alarms. Some learned to sleep sitting upright, back against a tree or wall, arms still wrapped around their gear. Others could doze lightly, even with the buzz of voices around them, trained to wake at the slightest change in tone. And always someone was awake. The watch changed hands quietly. A nod, a gesture, one man rising as another sat. The fire stirred back to life, and sleep began again for some, even as it ended for others. This cycle of vigilance and rest and vigilance became the heartbeat of the camp, an unspoken rhythm, known by all, questioned by none. For in the world of marching and battles, of shifting ground and uncertain tomorrows, a full night's sleep was a luxury. But a few hours, broken though they were, could be enough. Enough to rise, enough to march, enough to carry on through the cold and the dark. Even in the cold, even on hard ground, the mind wandered where the body could not. Beneath woolen cloaks, with the earth as mattress and the stars as ceiling, soldiers drifted in and out of sleep. In these quiet hours, dreams came uneven, flickering, like the low flame of a dying fire. We cannot know every dream that passed through their minds, but fragments survive in letters, in journals, in ancient texts, written long after the war cries had faded. What emerges is not a clear picture, but a shared sense, a mosaic of thought and memory, half-formed in the dark. Some dreamed of home, the curve of a familiar road, a doorway left ajar, the scent of bread from a kitchen long gone cold. These dreams were often vivid in their simplicity, family faces, appearing fully formed, old friends seated by imagined fires. A mother's voice, a child's laughter, sounds that had not been heard in months, or even years, surfaced with startling clarity in the hush of night. Others dreamed of past battles. Not the noise, not the clash itself, but moments, sensations. The weight of a shield pressed to the chest, the heat of sun on armor, the strange stillness just before a command. These dreams were not always nightmares, though some were. More often, they were fragments, images, emotions without beginning or end. Superstition shaped sleep as much as memory. Among Roman legions, dreams were taken seriously. A strange vision at night might be shared with an officer, or even a priest. Some believed dreams carried omens, warnings of danger, hints of glory, or signs from the divine. A lion walking through a river, a sword turning into a tree, a bird flying backwards. Each image could be interpreted, its meaning debated in low voices before morning broke. In medieval Europe, dreams were sometimes feared. They were thought to be vulnerable times when spirits might wander too freely, when the mind could be touched by forces beyond understanding. Charms were worn, prayers were whispered before sleep. Some tied small tokens to their bedding twigs, coins, even bits of bone, to ward off what they could not name. Yet for all the mystery, dreams also offered brief escape. For a few hours, a soldier might not be marching, might not be cold, might not be waiting for the next order. Instead, they could walk again through familiar fields, or climb hills that never truly existed. They could speak freely, laugh easily, move without armor or command. Waking, though, often came sharply. The shift from dream to watchfulness could be sudden. A footfall nearby, the creak of leather, a gust of wind pressing against the tent, and with it, the dream would fade gone before it could be held. Some tried to hold on. Lying still, eyes open but unmoving, they replayed what they could remember. A face, a name, a few soft words. But the moment always slipped away. There were dreams that returned, night after night, almost unchanged. A gate that could not be opened, a road that ended too soon. These were rarely spoken of. Carried silently, they became part of the rhythm of rest. Just as armor became familiar on the shoulders, so too did the shape of certain thoughts. In time, a kind of inner world took shape, made from memory, longing, and imagination. It lived beneath the surface, quiet during the day, more present at night. And though the soldier shared meals, marched in rank, and stood in formation with hundreds of others, this place, this landscape of thought, remained his alone. Sleep then was more than rest. It was retreat, a return to something softer, even when the ground was hard. In dreams, the war could be forgotten, if only briefly. And so the soldier closed his eyes again, wrapped himself in wool, let the cold air settle around him, and waited in stillness for the world behind his eyes to open once more. Across time and place, under stars both familiar and foreign, soldiers have always sought the same small thing at day's end, rest, whether lying beneath linen, wool, or nothing more than a cloak against the earth, whether beside comrades or alone by a dwindling fire. They all knew the stillness that comes only when motion ceases, when voices quiet, when the night finally settles over the camp like a second skin. And though their uniforms differed, bronze, leather, mail, or stitched cloth, though their languages changed, and their gods were many, the ritual remained. Remove the weight of armor, find a place to settle, listen to the wind, and sleep if sleep will come. It rarely came easily. The ground could be cold, the air could bite. Noise was never far away distant shouts, the beat of hooves, the restless murmur of horses, or the cough of someone nearby. And yet, amidst it all, they rested, somehow, not out of comfort, but out of necessity. Tomorrow would bring movement, orders, blades, or silence. And so, in those precious hours, rest was not simply desired, it was required, as vital as food, as important as breath. In the quiet moments just before sleep, a soldier might reflect or not. He might whisper a prayer, or replay the day's march in his mind. He might think of home, of someone far away, or of nothing at all. The stars looked down as they always had, indifferent, patient, steady, and under them, across centuries, thousands closed their eyes in the dark. They rested where they could, on riverbanks, in ruined villages, deep forests, open plains, sand-swept dunes, mountain passes. Sleep came in fragments, in borrowed hours, but it came, and with it, a brief return to something beyond orders and battle lines, to memory, to dreams, to silence. So tonight, as you listen, as you lie still, perhaps you share in that ancient stillness, however distant. You breathe in, slowly. The weight of the day begins to lift. And somewhere in your mind, the fires grow dim, the wind softens, and the watch is already changing. Let it pass. Let the rhythm of old stories carry you. Let your thoughts drift, unhurried, like smoke into the sky. And sleep now, if sleep will come.